Hi, it's a nice sunny day today, so I thought I'd take the chance to have a look at one of the main features of the camera which you've got to try and learn how to do, which is the exposure. After the focus, that's probably the second most important thing to try and master. And today you're going to have a quick look at auto exposure and how we can tweak that to get the best results. And then I'll have a look at manual exposure, which is far more complicated. So we'll have a look at auto exposure now. And the reason you might use auto exposure is A, you're learning the camera. It's a lot easier to use than manual exposure when you're first learning. B, it's handy for things like even now where I'm using auto exposure now because weather is changing a lot. It's cloudy and sunny at the same time, and for me doing this, it's very hard for me to change the settings endlessly on the camera. Also things like similar with your family, etc., your children perhaps, if you have kids, you want to film them, and like a camcorder, it's more convenient to have automatic settings for the exposure because they move around a lot, different situations, so it's very hard to keep changing the exposure perhaps for that. So the first thing to note, I'll just come out of record on this, regarding the settings for exposure, is where they are. So if you click on the menu button here, and the very first option in the movie section there is movie exposure, and by default it's set to auto. I click the set button there, you see auto or manual. I can go and click on manual. I'm in manual mode. I come out now by clicking the shutter button halfway. I'm now in manual exposure mode. So if I click the info button just to get a bit more info on the screen, you can see once you're in manual mode, you can see a camera there with an M on it. That indicates you're actually in manual mode when you've got that info screen up. If I come out of that, I'll just go back into menu mode, change that now back to auto, and I'll click the shutter, and you can see now the symbol there, there's no M, so we know now we're not in manual mode. Okay, so we'll have a look at automatic mode. So that's how you actually set the automatic mode if you're actually already in manual mode. And for exposure, you're going to be looking at the symbols down the bottom, which are typical sort of photographic symbols regarding exposure, as you'd see if you're just taking photos rather than videos. And again, you can scroll through the info buttons there to bring those up again. And if you click the shutter button halfway, you can see there it starts to gives you the information as to various settings there. ISO, that's the film speed, is 200 there. You can see the actual shutter speed is 160 there, 160th of a second, and the aperture there is 5.6. So when you're going to do manual exposure, we're going to have to learn what all these are and see how manually how to change them. The nice thing about automatic exposure, you can pretty well forget about that. For correct exposure in the frame or in the picture, it's basically looking, you can see there's kind of a heart shape in the middle there of the numbers, and you can see the line underneath it indicates that's where the exposure is at the moment, and that's, from the camera's point of view, the ideal exposure for this scene, and that indicates from its point of view again that this is exposed correctly because it's in the middle. If it goes up, as we'll see shortly, it means it's going to be overexposed. If it goes down the minus number, it's going to be too dark, it's going to be underexposed. Now it will always endeavour to keep that in the middle, and I can show you that. So if for whatever the sun conditions, so for example if I move the camera up to the sky, even though the sky is much brighter, you can see there the actual exposure settings is kept in the middle. And what it will be doing, if I click on the half of the shutter button there, you see it's got an ISO of 400, it's got a faster film for the sky, it's got a aperture of 16 because it's much brighter, it's made the aperture actually smaller, and the shutter speed there is 125. If I move it down again, it automatically changes the various settings there. So the ISO now is 1600, the aperture is 16, etc. And similarly, if I put it, well, it's not so dark there, but if I move, there's no dark area particularly. If I move it maybe over here, it's kind of a bit darker, slightly darker there. And if I click on the button halfway, you can see the aperture has gone down to 5.6 now, so it's letting in a lot more light on the ISO 1600. So in auto exposure mode, everything is changing all the time. It jiggles around the ISO, the aperture and the shutter speed continuously to give you the setting in the middle, which it regards is the best setting. And for the settings in auto, it uses, I think it uses the evaluative metering mode, which it basically takes a reading from various parts around the screen. I think it's slightly more favoured in the middle, so but it basically tries to be quite clever with the metering, and generally it works quite well. You know, so here, for example, if I put on the face there of Kate, you see it looks pretty good. Now, the only thing about metering is that when you're metering, it's hard to know just by looking, especially when you're dealing with a very small screen here on looking what you're looking at. So it's hard to know exactly. I mean, it looks okay, and it probably is okay, and it's telling us it's okay. But obviously, it's nice to know exactly, because the metering can be fooled sometimes if there's a lot of bright light around, or there's a dark light or the shadow in part of the screen, and it can't quite find the correct exposure. Here it should be fairly easy because it's actually in the middle of the screen, and it's lit fairly uniformly there by sunlight. Now, what you can do, and certainly if you know, I'd recommend it, is download the Magic Lantern software, because when you do, there's a lot of settings there that can help you check the exposure. And one of these, if I go back into it here, Magic Lantern, you can see there's something called zebras, and that allows you to actually see areas of the screen which are overexposed. It kind of has a hatching or zebra effect in areas. If I pan up now, you can see as I do, so for example, you can see there that house over there, it's got bright sunlight, it's white, it's relatively overexposed compared to the rest of the picture. It doesn't really bother us here in this shot, and you can see Kate's face actually is okay. There's no hatching on that. It looks pretty good. If I zoom in now, just a little bit more, you can see that it looks okay. So the zebras are handy though, because you can also have them to show underexposed areas as well. If we look at this, we're shooting now with a brighter light behind, although there are clouds coming again. And as I zoom in, if I zoom in now to another friend of mine, you can see here, because it's fooling the exposure system, it's bright behind, and because of the sky, and obviously it's underexposing his face now. So you can get around that. Obviously one way is to try and change the shot so it's not quite like this, but this is going to happen. So what you can do is try and make the best of the shot, and make sure that at least the face is exposed. And what you can do here, if you press the AV button here, you can see, and then turn the ring, you'll see you can actually increase the exposure. It's going up there, so that now the face there at least is better exposed. And I just need to focus that in a bit. Let's move that in there. Okay, so you can see there now that's the exposure has gone up there, and just beware of that, because whatever else you choose to then shoot, the overexposure will remain. So the sky will be obviously overexposed. It'll try and always overexpose there by that amount. It's 2 stops over there, you can see. So that's quite handy to know. So if I put that back, you can see there it's much too underexposed. That thinks it's a correct exposure, but we know it's not, because it's the face that we're actually trying to have as the correct exposure. And then I'll put that back. One other thing you should note, you can have a play with as well, is that you can actually hold the exposure. I'll just switch this off for a minute by using this star button up here. I can see that. I'll just pull the camera up a little bit, zoom it out. Star button here, you can see, if you press the star button, you might notice there a star appears here. So that will remember whatever you've exposure you want there, and it will try and, as you move, it will try and keep that exposure. So what does that mean? Well, for example, if I zoom in a little bit more there, and I'm kind of happy with that exposure, but if I move sideways, you can see his face goes dark again because there's more sky, brighter sky. If I go back again, the auto exposure brings it up again. What I can do, if I press the star button, see there, and I move over, it keeps that now. Now just beware of this, because that star button by default, it only stays for about 4 seconds by default. Just one thing to note, if you want to change that setting from, because I think you do need to change it if you're going to use it, 4 seconds is not long enough when you're setting up shots. If you go back into the menu and go to, you see the second option there across the top, is there's various options. It's metering timer you want to change, and it's set to 4 seconds. So say change that to even 30 seconds, okay? So I'll change that to 30 seconds. Now if I have my, say for example, my exposure there, I save that by pressing the star button. You see the star button down there, and I recompose my shot. You can see there it's going to last for 30 seconds, and it'll wait, well, 30 seconds or pressing the record button, whichever is the sooner. And once you've pressed the record button, that will stay as the exposure as you're recording. And if you want to cancel it, you see there the kind of the button, which is the kind of the magnifying button there on the far right next to the star one. If I click on that, it cancels the exposure reset, and it goes back to the automatic exposure again. So that star button there for the exposure is quite useful to know about in auto mode. So that's automatic exposure. We'll have a look now at the more complex issue of trying to set a manual exposure there with the help of my two friends.